Okay, in this video we're going to talk you through how to safely operate the lawnmower, which is one of the sort of bread and butter tools of any gardener. We're going to look at how to check the machine over to make sure it's safe to operate. We're going to look at the PPE and then just the basic functionality of the machine, setting the height, starting it and that sort of thing. As with any machine, we need to understand the specific PPE requirements, and most machines will have some stickers on it which denote the safety aspects of the machine that you need to be aware of. This particular machine, I've noticed today, are actually missing, so that in itself is a bit of a problem. We shouldn't have to get those replaced. I will just cutting an image of a different mower where you can actually see the images that should be on there. But essentially what we're going to need is ear protection, just because of the volume of the engine. Now, interestingly, it doesn't say you need eye protection, which whilst using the machine you don't, but in reality you're often going to be using this machine working closely with another person who would be using a strimmer, and if you're coming within 15 meters of that person using the strimmer, you really need to have eye protection on as well, because there is a risk of you getting stones flicked into your eyes, something like that. Okay, so ear protection definitely, and depending on what you're doing, possibly eye protection. Now, the other point with this is the spinning blade is where it's caught, where most of the danger comes from, and because you're obviously standing and it's at ground level, there's a danger of sort of cutting your feet. Now, there are various safety things in place whereby if you're not in the position of operating the machine, the blades should stop. But to protect against that, you do need to wear steel toe cap boots. Okay, so it's your steel toe cap boots, ear protection and possibly eye protection. And the other thing is, quite a good idea to wear gloves as well, although they're not essential. It's just it's not a bad idea, because you will have to be checking the blade or cleaning out the deck, and all that grass can get pretty nasty on the hands once it's kind of wet and all mushed up. That's just a recommendation, is to wear a pair of gloves at the same time. Now, when it comes to the safety of the machine in terms of whether the blade is on or not, there is variation in how different machines operate. Some have what they call a blade brake clutch. Others simply have sort of a dead man's handle, or like just an automatic stop if you let go of that handle. Now, with the blade brake clutch, the engine will continue to run as you step away from the machine, but the blade will be held on a brake. It will stop it. So in theory, you could come round, take the collector off with the engine still running. You could take your grass box off the back, empty your grass and put it back in. That's fine. Those blade brake clutches do wear. And what you can find is on an older machine, those blades can still be spinning, albeit usually at a slower rate, but it would still be enough to certainly hurt your hand or chop the ends of your fingers off. So whilst it's fine to take the grass collector off the back and dump the grass, do not under any circumstances ever put your hand in to clear blockages if the engine is still running. So if the machine gets blocked, regardless of the type of system that it is built with, you must turn the engine off completely if you're dealing with blockages. Okay, so only use rely on that blade brake clutch just to take the grass off, so you haven't got to keep stopping and starting the engine. This particular model doesn't have that. It's got the dead man's handle, which means any time this rear handle is up and you have to pull the starter to get it starting, those blades will be spinning. Now, as soon as you let go of that, the blades cut out because the engine cuts out. So this isn't really a professional machine. This is what you would call a sort of top of the range domestic machine. So it has a slightly different operation. Okay, so to start this machine, you would put it towards the rabbit, which is full throttle. Sometimes there's also a choke, which you can sort of push it into the choke position. You would put that handle up, which disengages that automatic stop feature I was telling you about. You put your ear defenders on. Now, because the blades are going to start on this one, I'm going to tip the blades out of that grass very slightly. That's rubbish. Okay, so in this particular instance, because we've had the machine on its side, whilst we were demoing, cleaning out the deck and that sort of thing, I think what's happened there is that it just needs to stay settled so that the fuel and that sort of gets into the right position. It can quite often happen is once the machine's been on its side for a long time, it's quite hard to start. But in practice, that's how it would start. I did start it earlier just to make sure it was okay, and it started absolutely fine. So I know there's nothing wrong with that. It's purely because it's been on its side for quite a long time for the purposes of the video we're doing today. So the first thing we're going to look at is just checking the machine over, make sure it's safe to use in a good condition. First thing we're going to look at is checking the mower blade. To do that, you're going to need to turn the machine over. Before you do that, there's a few things you need to think about. So the air filter will either be on one side of the machine or the other. When you tip the machine, you need to make sure that air filter is uppermost. Otherwise, you'll get all the fuel pouring out through the air filter. Second thing, because we're going to be moving that blade around by our hands, in theory you could start the engine by doing that. So what we need to make sure is that we actually take the spark plug cap off, which is usually at the front of the machine, and it just simply carefully give it a wiggle and it should pull off. Okay, so at that point you're ready to tip the machine over, air filter uppermost, all the way over, and that will then expose the underneath of the machine. Okay, so we've got the machine on its side, and the first thing you'll notice is there's quite a lot of debris. Now that could potentially be hiding damage to that mower deck. So first thing we'd look to do in this instance is actually clean off all this kind of mess on there. And you can see that parts of this particular deck are made of plastic, so you could quite see that there could be cracks in that or something like that. So I'm not going to go ahead and clean all of this, but just to sort of give you an idea, you could go in and scrape all that off, get it nice and clean. And what that's also going to do, as well as giving you a better visual inspection, when you actually come to use the machine, you're going to get much better airflow in there, and it's going to collect that grass better, which is going to be particularly important when it's sort of long or wet grass. Okay, so assume the mower deck's all nice and clean and we can see the blades. The first thing we're going to be looking for is checking that this blade is not got any obvious damage or wear on it. So we can check the edge of these blades, top and bottom. It's in pretty good condition. It's obviously been used, but that's perfectly serviceable. The other thing we're looking at is any cracks. And again, there's no cracks in there. What we can do just to check the blade is straight is if we look at the tip of the blade, see how that sits with the edge of the deck, and as we turn that round, what you can see is that this blade is actually sitting differently to the other side, so there is a bit of a bend in that particular blade. Now if you are cutting a fine quality lawn, that may show up as uneven sort of striping, but on most lawns that would be fine, because what would end up happening is the part of the blade that sits the lowest will just govern where it's actually cut, so that will end up doing the finish cut height. The other side of the blade will just end up sort of cutting and mulching, but something to keep an eye on. If that was much worse than that, you'd really want to be replacing that blade, I would have thought. But what it's important to do when you're cutting the grass is look behind you and actually see the quality of the cut. And if it does seem to be cutting unevenly, it could be something like that, and you would understand what's happening because you've checked the blade. So we're going to check the air filter, and that is housed inside this protective cover. On this particular model, we've just got to undo the thumb screw there. Different mowers will have slightly different ways of accessing the air filter, but the principles are all the same. So we just take the cover off. This one sort of comes off on a bit of a hinge. Now inside there you've got a sponge pre-filter, so we can just take that off Check that's all nice and clean. If this had a lot of debris in it, we could use an airline hose to sort of blow out all the debris, blow the sponge, and then sort of gently place that back in. And the other part of the filter, and this bit is replaceable, but that's in excellent condition. They get quite dirty, but again, you can sort of, gently with the airline hose, open that up, blow it through if there's any significant amounts of debris in there. It's also worth checking if there's a lot of fuel there. Sometimes you can have issues where the fuel is coming out through the carburetor if there's leaks and that sort of thing. That all looks clean and dry, so we pop that back in there. Make sure it sits firmly, because we don't want any gaps where dust can get into the machine, because that's going to cause excessive wear. Then we pop that back on, do the thumb screw back up, and that one is good to go. So if that air filter was in poor condition or was clogged with a lot of dirt and debris, what will happen is the machine will struggle to run smoothly, and it may keep cutting out, or you might not be able to start the machine, for example. Okay, so we're going to move on to checking the oil levels in the machine. This is really important because you don't want the engine seizing up. Now, depending on the age of the machine and whether or not you are topping up the oil from time to time, will sort of determine how often you should be checking this machine. So again, slight differences in different machines, but the principle is the same. So each machine is going to have a dipstick, and at the end of the dipstick will be a gauge telling you how much oil is in the machine. So it's quite simply a case of twisting it off, and you will need a rag. So in the first instance, we clean off the oil, because that could have just been sort of splashed in through movement of the machine and use. You do need to make sure the machine is on a level ground. We are actually on a slightly sloping ground here, but just for the sake of the video, we'll assume we are on a level ground. If I was doing this for real, I would make sure it's on a sort of a level sort of area of concrete or something like that. So the dipstick goes in, you close it right up, open it up again, and then you're looking at the marks at the end of the dipstick and just looking at whether that oil is between the maximum and minimum, and you really want it just up somewhere just below the maximum. And this one, I would suggest, is actually slightly high, so there's probably a little bit more oil in there than it needs to be. It doesn't necessarily cause a lot of problems, but you could end up with a sort of a smoking machine, that sort of thing. And we put that back in. So as I say, if you find it is near the minimum or even below the minimum, you will need to top that up. If you've topped it up, you'll want to be checking that at least the following day to make sure it's where you left it, because there could be an oil leak, or the oil could be getting into the engine and getting burnt off. So check it the following day or the following time you use it. If you have to top it up with oil again, then you're definitely going to have to be checking it every time, and it's starting to indicate there's a problem that it's burning up or losing oil somehow. So if you're regularly using a machine and the oil level is stable, then probably checking it once or twice a week is going to be adequate. But as soon as you see movements in the oil level, you need to be checking it much more often, because there's a greater risk of it running out. And if it does run out, the engine could seize up, and that'll be the whole engine knackered, which we certainly don't want to do. So we're going to check the fuel. Before we start, we want to make sure the fuel level's up, certainly if you're going to do a big area of lawn. Now, again, it's quite important, a bit like checking the oil, you want to make sure you're on a nice level ground, and if you are going to top up, don't do it on the grass. You must be on sort of a gravel area, or an area where if you did get a bit of fuel spill, it's not going to mark someone's patio, it's not going to kill off the grass, because any fuel that gets on the grass, it will kill it off. Okay, so it's just a case of looking inside the machine, visual inspection. You will see, whether there's enough in there or not. There's hardly anything in this one, so I'd be looking to get a funnel. It's not a huge opening in these fuel tanks, so you'd want to put a funnel on there and pour your petrol in. Now, these are all straight petrol engines, It's not two-stroke and it's not diesel. It's going to be your unleaded fuel. So top it up, do that one back up. And just carrying on with that visual inspection, you want to just sort of check, you're checking the wheels, look right. You're making sure there's no obvious external damage to the mower deck, any of the protective housing. You want to take a look at the pull cord, make sure that's not frayed, because if there's a lot of fraying in there, there's a good chance it's going to snap soon, and you'd want to get that one replaced, because the last thing you want to do is be an hour away from the depot and end up with a snapped cord and no mower to use. So something like that is worth checking before you leave the yard, really, because that's a bit of an involved repair where you're going to need a few bits of tools to do that one. Okay, so that's all good. Checking the mower box, so you're just making sure that again there's no obvious big chunks broken off and that it's actually sitting on there properly. All your controls are okay, they're all sitting where they should be. These handles can get caught in branches and get bent and that sort of thing and end up not working properly. So that all looks good. And the last thing you'll be wanting to do before actually starting a job is checking that the height adjustment is where you'd want it to be. Now again, it does vary from machine to machine. This one's got what they call a central cutting height adjuster, which is one single switch, and you push the switch in and you either lift or push down the machine, and there's a numbered scale there that tells you what height you're cutting at. Now on other machines there'll be an individual height adjuster for every wheel, and you would have to just sort of go around and do them and make sure they're all the same height. There's lots of different mowers out there, and the controls do vary to some degree. So rather than actually talk you through this, I think it's important just to either look at the handbook of the particular machine you're going to use, or get someone who is familiar with the machine to show you the operation. The functionality is all the same, but how that functionality is engaged does differ a little bit. So that's fine. So presuming we've got the machine going, the last thing to think about is, so you're going to go off and cut the grass. The strimmer should have done the edges before you do the grass if you're collecting, so that you're picking up the strimming debris as well as your own debris. That'll leave a neater finish. And in terms of making sure it's collecting, do keep an eye on the areas that you've just cut to make sure the finish is as you want it, whether that's the height of the cut needs readjusting, or whether the grass is actually being collected properly. It's surprising how far you can go on not realising the grass bag is full up, which could be a sort of a clogged deck, or it just could be full up and needs emptying. So don't just sort of mindlessly keep mowing along. Look at the area of grass that you've just cut and ensure that the finish you're looking for is actually there. Otherwise, do something about that and make sure we do get it. So in conclusion, we've got all the PPE sorted out, goggles if you need them, eye protection, ear protection, steel toe cap boots, gloves on. We've checked the machine over, in particular the fuel, the oil levels, the blade is in good condition, and the machine overall is in good condition. We've familiarised ourselves with the controls, and we're good to go with that machine.